So welcome to those who are joining for the second session of this series, Understanding the Complex History of Palestine and Israel. So yesterday was very much an Old Testament potted history, if you like. But I thought it was necessary to do that because it reveals, number one, that our common ancestor Abraham, who we, the Judeo-Christian tradition, trace our ancestry back to Abraham through his son Isaac. The Islam and the Jews believe that the Arabs trace their ancestry back to Abraham through Ishmael, the son of Hagar, the slave girl. Abraham came from the Ur of the Chaldees, which is in current-day Iraq. So our common ancestor is an Iraqi, and that's what he would look like. That's one point. The other is the claim to the promised land that modern-day Israel makes, that this was the land God promised to us. This was the land that we're entitled to. It's as part of that potted history yesterday. There was a total period of 99 years of a united Israel kingdom, from the anointing of Saul to the death of Solomon. 99 years out of a 4,000-year history in which there was a united Israel in that land. Later we had the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty, that lasted for 103 years, from 166 to 63 BC. 103 years. So in that long history, 202 years of a united Israel occupying and controlling that piece of land. Kind of begs the question in terms of who is in charge, and then the fact that between the 4th and 16th centuries there was only one attempt to establish some kind of Jewish political center in Palestine, and that was in the middle of the 16th century when a Portuguese Sephardi Jew, Joseph Nasi, tried to gather the Portuguese Jews, first to migrate to Cyprus, then to settle in Tiberias. So in a 1200-year period there were no attempts. Then another 300 years later, in the 19th century, is when a current in Judaism supporting a return to Zion grew in popularity. Zion is a hill near Jerusalem, referred to as Mount Zion in the Psalms, and has come to be understood as widely symbolizing the land of Israel. This gave rise to the Zionist movement of the 19th century. The common denominator among all Zionists has been a claim to Palestine, a land traditionally known in Jewish writings as the land of Israel. Remember, that was the name of Jacob, and the tribes were the sons of Jacob, sons of Israel. But Palestine was a land traditionally known in Jewish writings as the land of Israel, as a national homeland of the Jews, and as a legitimate focus for Jewish national self-determination, which in terms of the history I've just shared and the length of time that they actually controlled the land is a little questionable. But after almost 2,000 years of the Jewish diaspora residing in various countries without a national state, The Zionist movement was founded in the late 19th century by secular Jews, largely as a response by the Ashkenazi Jews to rising anti-Semitism in Europe. The political movement was formally established by the Austro-Hungarian journalist Theodor Herzl in 1897, following the publication of his book, The Jewish State. At that time, the movement sought to encourage Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine, particularly among those Jewish communities who were poor, unassimilated into the life and culture of their adopted countries, and whose floating presence caused disquiet, in Herzl's view, among assimilated Jews and stirred anti-Semitism among Christians. In 1896, Herzl expressed his views on the restoration of the Jewish state. He considered anti-Semitism to be an eternal feature of all societies in which Jews lived as minorities, and that only a sovereign state could allow Jews to escape eternal persecution. Let them give us a sovereignty over a piece of the earth's surface, just sufficient for the needs of our people, and we will do the rest, said Theodor Herzl. The word Semite, because the Jews speak a lot of anti-Semitism, the word Semite refers to a language and cultural group made up of ancient and modern people. Semitic languages include Akkadian, Arabic, Aramaic, Moabite, Hebrew, Phoenician, Assyrian, and Babylonian. Biblically, the Semites are considered the descendants of Shem, the son of Noah. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first use of anti-Semitic for a person who discriminates or is prejudiced against Jews was in the 1880s, around the same time as the rise of Zionism. So the dictionary defines anti-Semitism as being against the Jews, but the Jews aren't the only Semites. So if we return to the original meaning of what it means to be Semitic, it's difficult to call Palestinians and other Arabs anti-Semitic because they themselves are Semites. Palestinian Arabs oppose the state policies of Israel that deny them legitimate human and civil rights and the right to a state. Early Zionists were the primary Jewish supporters of the idea that Jews are a race, expressing the views that Jews are not merely members of a cultural or religious entity, but were an integral and biological entity. This was particularly important in early nation building in Israel because Jews in Israel are ethnically diverse, and the origins of Ashkenazi Jews, the original founders of Zionism, are highly debated and enigmatic. This is considered important to the state of Israel because its founding narrative is based on the biblical concept of gathering of the exiles and return to Zion, on the assumption that modern Jews are the primary descendants of the Jews of the biblical stories. The question has been focused on by Zionists and anti-Zionists, as in the absence of this biblical primacy, the Zionist project can be accused of being settler colonialism pursued under false assumptions, fueling the indignation of the displaced and stateless Palestinian people, while right-wing Israelis look for a way of proving that the occupation is legitimate. A Jewish biological self-definition has become a standard belief for many Jewish nationalists, and most Israeli population researchers have never doubted that evidence will one day be found, even though so far such facts have remained elusive. In the 19th century, a current in Judaism supporting a return to Zion was growing in popularity in response to growing hostility and anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe. The idea of returning to Palestine was rejected by the conferences of rabbis held around that time. Reform Jews rejected this idea of a return to Zion. The Conference of Rabbis held at Frankfurt am Main in 1845 deleted from the ritual all reference to a return to Zion and a restoration of a Jewish state. The Philadelphia Conference of 1869 decreed that the messianic hope of Israel is the union of all the children of God in the confession of the unity of God. In 1885, the Pittsburgh Conference reiterated this interpretation of the messianic idea of Reform Judaism, expressing in a resolution that we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and we therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning a Jewish state. However, there was a steady but small migration of Jews, mainly from Europe, to Palestine, to escape the hostility they endured in Europe. Sir Moses Montefiore established a colony for Jews in Palestine. Initially, there were several options considered for the establishment of a Jewish state, including Uganda and Argentina. In 1903, the British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain offered Herzl 13,000 square kilometers in the Uganda Protectorate for Jewish settlement in Great Britain's East Africa colonies. This was carefully evaluated by Herzl and was presented to the World Zionist Organization, where, after fierce debate, the offer was declined. Argentina was never considered viable, given its distance from the historic homeland. After Herzl died in 1905, the World Zionist Organization decided to direct all future settlement efforts solely to Palestine. Lobbying by the Russian Jewish immigrant Chaim Weizmann and the fear that American Jews would encourage the US to support Germany in the war against Russia culminated in the British government's Balfour Declaration of 1917. It endorsed the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine as follows: His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. In 1919, the King Crane Commission for and against Zionism, consisting of Henry Churchill King and Charles R. Crane, summarized the arguments presented to the Commission as follows. The arguments in favor of Zionism as presented by its supporters have often been stated and need not now be presented in detail. The chief elements are that Palestine once belonged to the Jews and that they were driven out by force. For 2,000 years they've been longing and praying to come back. While Jews of the world are now far too numerous to be collected in Palestine, they are entitled to have somewhere a state which can be a refuge to the oppressed among them and an expression of their continuance and unity. Despite proposals at Paris, there is persecution of the Jews in Poland at the present moment. There is the prospect of the disintegration of the Jews in Western civilization and their coalescence with nations where they reside. They should have an opportunity to restore their ancient language and culture and preserve them in the old environment. There is no need of displacing the present population, for with afforestation, modern methods of agriculture, utilization of water power, reclamation of wastelands, scientific irrigation, and the like, the land can contain several times the present number of its inhabitants. If some of the present population desire to sell their lands, they will receive a good price, and there is plenty of room for them in other Arab countries. The Jewish colonies have been a great benefit to the native Arabs by teaching methods of agriculture, improving sanitation, and the like. The unfolding of the Zionist plan will bring great prosperity to all in the land, both present population and immigrants. The native Arabs and Christians, who so unitedly oppose Zionism, urge the following principal considerations. The land is owned and occupied by them. Arabs were there before the Jews came. The Jews were immigrants who treated the former inhabitants with the greatest cruelty and who remained a comparatively short time. That immigration and cruelty I spoke a little bit about yesterday, when the Hebrews of the Exodus entered the land and cities were destroyed, populations were destroyed, cities were burnt. They remained a comparatively short time. They were unable to maintain control over the whole land. As I've just said, there's a total of 202 years in the Old Testament period and a little bit of the intertestamental period. Unable to maintain control over the whole land or even union among themselves, they were expelled by the Romans and formed permanent residence elsewhere 2,000 years ago. The Arabs conquered the land 1,300 years ago and have remained ever since. It is their actual home and not just a residence of long ago. As Christians and Muslims, they can honor all the holy places, while the Jews can honor only their own. The Jews are a religion and not a nation. They will, if given control, forbid the use of the Arabic language, the measure which caused the break between the Young Turks and the Arabs. The Jewish colonies have shown no benevolence to the Arabs in their neighborhoods. It is denied that their activities have influenced the Arabs towards progress. The Jews have much money, education, and shrewdness, and will soon buy out and maneuver away the present inhabitants. The Arabs are friendly to the Jews long resident in the land, who use the Arabic language. They will resist to the uttermost the immigration of foreign Jews and the establishment of a Jewish government. However, in 1922, the League of Nations adopted the Balfour Declaration and granted to Britain the Palestinian Mandate. The mandate will ensure the establishment of the Jewish national home and the development of self-governing institutions, and also safeguard the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. History has proven those words of the Mandate and the Balfour Declaration to be meaningless. The rise of Nazism, the increased hostility toward and oppression of Jews by Hitler, and the Holocaust saw waves of immigrants from Europe to Palestine, despite Britain curtailing the number of Jewish immigrants. The first two-state solution was proposed by Britain in 1939, which was later repealed and replaced by the White Paper of 1939, which planned to end Jewish immigration by 1944 and to allow no more than 75,000 additional Jewish migrants. At the end of the 5-year period, only 51,000 of the 75,000 immigration certificates provided for had been utilized, and the British offered to allow immigration to continue beyond the cut-off date of 1944 at a rate of 1,500 per month until the remaining quota had been filled. At the end of the Second World War, the mandatory government had 10,938 certificates remaining. The British maintained the policies of the 1939 White Paper until the end of the mandate. The growth of the Jewish community in Palestine and the devastation of the European Jewish life sidelined the World Zionist Organization. The Jewish Agency for Palestine, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, increasingly dictated policy with support from American Zionists who provided funding, including via the highly effective American Palestine Committee. During World War II, as the horrors of the Holocaust became known, the Zionist leadership formulated the 1 million plan, a reduction from Ben-Gurion's original target of 2 million Jewish immigrants. Following the end of the war, many stateless refugees, mainly Holocaust survivors, began migrating in small boats to Palestine in defiance of British rules. The Holocaust united much of the rest of world Jewry behind the Zionist project. In 1945, the United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt met with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud pointed out that it was Germany who had committed crimes against the Jews, and so Germany should be punished. Palestinian Arabs had done no harm to European Jews and did not deserve to be punished by losing their land. Roosevelt, on return to the United States, concluded that Israel could only be established and maintained by force. Here's a table that shows the population of Palestine by ethno-religious groups from the 1946 survey of Palestine. And there we can see from 1922, 486,000 Muslims, 83 or 84,000 Jews, 71,000 Christians, 77,700 odd others, to 1946, 1,076,000, 77,000 Muslims, 608,000 Jews, 145,000 Christians, 15,000 others, the total population of 1.8 million, but 58.3% in 1946 were Muslims. In January 1946, the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry was tasked to establish political, economic, and social conditions in mandatory Palestine and the well-being of the peoples now living there, to consult representatives of Arabs and Jews, and to make other recommendations as necessary for an interim handling of these problems, as well as for their eventual solution. After several solutions failed to gain support, the British referred the question to the United Nations on the 14th of February 1947. In 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine recommended that Western Palestine should be partitioned into a Jewish state, an Arab state, and a United Nations controlled territory around Palestine. I'm going to show a picture that has three maps. We have on the left-hand side, in 1947, the land occupied by the Palestinians shown in green, the land occupied by Jewish settlements shown in white. The second picture is the partition plan of 1947. Again, with the green areas Palestinian, the white areas Jewish, and the little yellow dot in the middle is the United Nations controlled area around Jerusalem. We'll come to the other figures later, and I'll show this map a few times. But the second from the left is the partition plan of the United Nations in 1947. The partition plan was adopted on the 29th of November 1947 with United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181. The vote led to celebrations in Jewish communities and protests in Arab communities throughout Palestine. It might be important at this point to say Arab communities in Palestine are not exclusively Muslim communities. There are Arab Christians, there are Arab Jews, there are Arab Muslims, there are Arab Druids, an ancient religion. In fact, Jesus was an Arab Jew who lived in Palestine. Violence throughout the country. Previously, an Arab and Jewish insurgency against the British, who held the mandate, remember? Jewish-Arab communal violence spiraled into the 1947 to 1949 Palestine War. The conflict led to an exodus of about 711,000 Palestinian Arabs outside of Israel's territory. More than a quarter had fled prior to the Israeli Declaration of Independence on 14 May 1948 and the start of the war. So back to that map, you can see the actual, so the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947. We see what we ended up with after the war, the 1947 to 1949 Palestinian War, with a much reduced Palestinian area, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The rest is Israel. And that was from 1949 to 1967. In the Declaration of Independence for the State of Israel, the following is said: the State of Israel will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on precepts of liberty, justice, and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets. Will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex. Will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture. Will safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of shrines and holy places of all religions, and will dedicate itself to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. If the State of Israel had held to that part of the Declaration of Independence, we wouldn't be where we are now. However, after the 1949 armistice agreements, a series of laws passed by the first Israeli government prevented displaced Palestinians from claiming private property or returning on the state's territories. They and many of their descendants remain refugees supported by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, the UNRWA. In 1975, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 3379, which designated Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. That resolution was repealed in 1991 under pressure from the government of then US President George H.W. Bush, the father of the later President George W. Bush, who invaded Iraq, and replaced with Resolution 46/86 because Israel had made revocation of Resolution 3379 a condition of its participation in the Madrid Peace Conference. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an ongoing military and political conflict. Beginning in the mid-20th century, it is one of the world's longest continuing conflicts. The 1947 United Nations partition plan for Palestine was never implemented and provoked the 1947-1949 Palestine War. The current Israeli-Palestinian status quo began following Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, known as the Palestinian Territories, in the Six-Day War. So back to the map, the Six-Day War was in 1967. There we see the 1967 borders, to which reference will be made again. Progress was made towards a two-state solution with the Oslo Accords of 1993 to 1995. Final status issues include the status of Jerusalem, Israeli settlements, borders, security and water rights, as well as Palestinian freedom of movement and the Palestinian right of return. Remember, there are still refugees from 1947-48 living in the Near East. Both Palestinians and Jews claim Jerusalem as their capital, and this has been described as one of the most intractable issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with conflicting claims to sovereignty over the city or parts of it and access to its holy sites. Remember, the Jewish Declaration of Independence spoke about the sanctity and inviolability of shrines and holy places of all religions. There are conflicting claims to sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem or parts of it and access to its holy sites. The main dispute revolves around the legal status of East Jerusalem, which is Palestinian, and the Old City of Jerusalem. So the YMCA, an organization with which I work, has a YMCA in West Jerusalem and the YMCA of East Jerusalem, which is Palestinian, and a YMCA in Gaza, which is Palestinian, which was bombed the other day. Broader agreement exists with Israel's presence in West Jerusalem in accordance with Israel's internationally recognized borders. Most countries support that Jerusalem should be the capital of both Israel and Palestine. The majority of the United Nations member states hold the view that the final status of Jerusalem should be resolved through negotiation, and have therefore favored locating their embassies to Israel in Tel Aviv. Only 5 countries have embassies to Israel in Jerusalem: the United States, thanks to Donald Trump, Guatemala, Honduras, Papua New Guinea, and Kosovo. Israeli settlements or colonies are civilian communities where Israeli citizens live, almost exclusively of Jewish identity or ethnicity, built on lands occupied by Israel since the Six-Day War. The international community considers Israeli settlements to be illegal under international law, although Israel disputes this. Israeli settlements currently exist in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, claimed by the State of Palestine as its sovereign territory, and in the Golan Heights, which is internationally considered Syrian territory. These are considered by the international community to be occupied territory, and Israel has been told to desist from settling in these territories, which it has ignored, and continues to expand the settlements. As of January 2023, there are 144 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including 12 in East Jerusalem. 670,000 Israelis live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in territories that the international community declares illegal. But Israel continues to expand their settlements there, reducing land available to the Palestinians for their income-producing agriculture, especially olive trees. Now consider the map as it has changed from 1947, Palestinian land in green, to the present, Palestinian land in green. This area is declared illegally occupied territory. Israel disputes this. Restriction of the movement of Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied territories by Israel is an issue in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Following the 1967 war, the occupied territories were proclaimed closed military zones. In 1972, general exit orders were issued, permitting residents of those territories to move freely between the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza. Overall closure of the territories was ordered in 1993, following Palestinian uprisings, resulting in total closure after further Palestinian political violence. Israel enforces restrictions on the freedom of movement of Palestinians in the West Bank by employing a system of temporary, permanent, and randomly manned checkpoints, the West Bank barrier, and by forbidding the usage of roads by Palestinians. Israel says these restrictions are necessary to protect Israelis living in Israel and Israeli settlements, which have been declared illegal occupations internationally. A World Bank report concludes, as long as Israeli restrictions to access to land and water resources and movement are in place, and the majority of the West Bank remains to a large degree inaccessible for Palestinian economic investment, the investment climate will remain unfavorable and business opportunities much below potential. So I'm going to stop there for today. Just to recap from the Old Testament, there were only a period, the Old Testament and the intertestamental period, including the Hasmonean dynasty, it was 202 years of a united Israeli country controlled by the Jews. 1200 years between the 4th century and the 16th century, there was only one attempt to establish some sort of Jewish political center in Palestine. In the 19th century, we saw the rise of Zionism, largely because of the persecution of Jews in Europe. But after almost 2,000 years of the Jewish diaspora, suddenly they started looking, let's go back to Palestine, which had been occupied by Palestinian Arabs throughout the entire 2,000-year period when the Jews were settled in the diaspora. Some Jews remaining in Palestine, regarded as Arab Jews. All the declarations, the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the State of Israel talk about the establishment of the State of Israel doing nothing to prejudice the civil rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The British mandate will ensure the establishment of the Jewish national home and also safeguard the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. And the Jewish Declaration of Independence, based on the precepts of liberty, justice and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets, uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed or sex, guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education and culture, and safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of shrines and holy places of all religions. The kicker phrase here being all its citizens, because the State of Israel has denied citizenship to Palestinians. The Palestinians are regarded as those who have legal papers to occupy or to live in Israel, but they are not Israeli citizens. So we'll stop there and tomorrow come to the build-up to the current conflict. Although we've seen the build-up already, because we've been told the current conflict didn't start on October the 7th. It started 75 years ago, 1948, the declaration of the State of Israel. So thank you again for joining. Please be free to join again tomorrow, where we will look further at the current conflict.